Well, hi there. This is a thorny devil, one of the craziest looking animals in the world. And this is a horned lizard. Both of these are spiky little ant-eating lizards, and yet the thorny devil is more closely related to this than it is to a horned lizard. Same thing goes for this. It's more closely related to a chameleon than it is to this. This isn't an anole. Yep, it's closer to chameleons too. This isn't an anole either, but it does fly, or at least fall with style. And this isn't a Dilophosaurus. Nor did Dilophosaurus have a frill like that. In other words, this is a lizard that is so cool that movie makers thought that they could improve one of the coolest dinosaurs that ever existed by making them a little bit more like it. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because other than Dilophosaurus, all of these animals fall into the hyper-diverse clade Iguania. And yes, it also includes iguanas, as well as things like this, and this. And of course, these. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know I've been carrying my Raycon everyday earbuds for the last several months, and I love them. I don't go anywhere without them. I use them all the time. I'm always listening to something. I very rarely have time to sit down and watch something, but I listen to something while I'm working with reptiles and commuting, and my earbuds, they're with me all the time now. Well, Raycon has improved upon them. Considerably, I might add. After selling more than 3 million really amazing earbuds, they said, let's make them better. And so they made them way better. They've added active noise cancellation, which I have noise canceling gigantic headphones, and I love that experience. It's the only thing I really was missing when I moved to these, though it was still a no-brainer to use these virtually all the time. Well, now they've got that as well. And then on top of that, they've got multi-point connectivity, which means that you can have it synced to multiple devices simultaneously, which is important because if you've got active noise cancellation turned on, you can turn it off, but if you've got it on, you're not going to hear anything that isn't synced up to your earbuds, and so you can sync it up to your computer and your phone and any other devices you need all at the same time, which is an amazing new feature. So somehow they've taken what are already my favorite earbuds in the world and made them way better. These have always charged quickly, and the battery honestly lasts forever, but now they charge even faster and the battery lasts even longer. 32 hours on a single charge. Plus, you can charge them up for 90 minutes of use in just 10 minutes. And they're highly water resistant and sweat resistant, which is really, really important because you might be jogging with them, or just when you carry them in your everyday life and it rains, or who knows what you get into, haven't had a problem at all. If these seem like the right earbuds for you, and if they're not, I don't know what you're looking for, click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/Clint to get 15% off of your Raycon purchase plus free shipping. That's buyraycon.com/Clint. And remember, these are not only amazing, but they're very affordable as well. Plus, they've got a 30-day happiness guarantee. Now back to our show. The clade Iguania is composed of two separate clades, the Acrodonta and the pleurodonta, which can most easily be differentiated by a close examination of their teeth, especially in a skull, where you can see clearly how the teeth attach themselves to the skull. In lepidosaurs, there are two main ways that teeth attach to the skull. The simplest, and probably the weakest, is that the teeth are not anchored into the skull at all, but rather fused to the surface of the skull like the ossicones of a giraffe. These are called Acrodont teeth. We see Acrodont dentition in tuataras, like this one, though these aren't lizards, as well as some amphisbaenians and some snakes, which totally are lizards. At least if anything that we're discussing today are lizards. Then snakes and amphisbaenians, well, they are too. And acrodont dentition is probably, unsurprisingly, what is found in the Acrodonta. But there is another way. Most other lizards, like this Gila monster, have their teeth essentially in half sockets. As in, the teeth are in little bone channels. The outer surface of the tooth root is fused to bone, but the tongue side portion of the root is only secured by ligaments and is totally visible when looking at the bones without the tissue. So it's like a half socket. And this half socket dentition is called pleurodont. And if you had to guess which form of dentition the pleurodonta possess, well, let's just say I will be unimpressed if you can't guess correctly. Altogether, the Iguania are the closest living relatives to the Anguimorpha, such as monitor lizards, Gila monsters, and their relatives that we discussed in this video. And after that, their closest living relatives are snakes. So they are more closely related to snakes than they are to lizards like tegus, skinks, or geckos. Which is why you can't make a clade that includes iguanians, and any of those that doesn't include the snakes. That's why snakes are lizards. And we have a video about all of them as well. But right now, I really want to talk about the pleurodonta, because I have a big question about this group. This entire clade is found almost exclusively in the Americas. But then there is this iguana, which is found only in Fiji, which I think I understand. There is a straight path from the Americas to Fiji.
See here? Yeah. This is us. And all the way around here, Fiji.
The wind even blows from the east at that latitude. The ocean currents go that way. They probably got to Fiji in about the same way that the amphisbaenids got to South America from Africa, by rafting. It's a pretty straight shot from South America to Fiji. But that isn't my big question, because there is a whole family of pleurodontan lizards endemic to Madagascar. That means that they would not only need to raft from South America to Fiji, a voyage that is already nearly prohibitively long.
You can't get any further away before you start coming back.
But they would need to start coming back. They would need to miss Fiji, which isn't hard to do, but also New Caledonia, Australia, and one of the densest large conglomerations of islands anywhere on the planet. And then extend their journey that has already gone all the way across the Pacific Ocean, all the way to the other side of the world, and they would have to continue all the way across the Indian Ocean as well. The distance from Fiji to Madagascar is actually greater than the distance from the Americas to Fiji. So it would more than double the journey, all the while with minimal food and next to no access to fresh water. This journey would take the better part of a year. So if this is what happened, how did this happen? And if this isn't what happened, how did they get to Madagascar? And given that the pleurodontan lizards are some of the most amazing and common lizards on the side of the earth where I most frequently reside, it seems like a good place to start. But don't worry, I won't forget to talk about chameleons. I can forget a lot of things, but chameleons aren't one of those things. But this lizard is one that I have been seeing a lot in my recent trips to Florida. These are members of the family Leocephalidae, the curly-tailed lizards, though their scientific name means smooth-headed. And they do have pretty smooth heads, but man, if you spend any time at all watching these lizards and that was your takeaway, you were really focused on their heads the whole time. Because they run around with their tails curled up over their bodies virtually always. It's sort of like the tail of a chameleon, but it curls up instead of down. And the reason that it curls is actually a whole lot less obvious. Though it seems to have something to do with discouraging predators, or at least making the tail a more conspicuous target, as they do it more often when a predator is present than when one is not. The 23 or so species of curly-tailed lizards are all found in the Caribbean islands, and they are the most distantly related family in all of the pleurodonta. It looks like they diverged away from the other members of the clade more than 90 million years ago during the Cretaceous. Which means that when the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, the ancestors of curly-tailed lizards had already been on their own path for more than 20 million years. It also gives us an upper limit as to when the other groups would have diversified. Since this is the basal-most family, the rest have to have diversified since then. But 90 million years ago, the trip from the southern tip of South America to Madagascar was not nearly as long as it is today. In fact, I think there's a decent chance that the winds and currents could have taken something on a straight and comparatively way short path to Madagascar without ever going anywhere near Fiji. So I'm excited to see if this has anything to do with how the members of the pleurodonta got there. But if the curly tail and smooth head aren't enough for you to identify curly-tailed lizards, then their overlapping scales and lack of femoral pores These little pores on the upper legs along the femur of many lizard species, especially in males, well, they ain't got them. So 90 million years, that's when the hagfish of pleurodontans broke away from the rest of the clade. The next most distantly related members of the pleurodonta are probably the best known family in the clade. In fact, if you could name just one family in all of Iguania, it'd probably be this one, the family Iguanidae, which is a totally rad family that includes all sorts of iguanas. In the past, it included a whole lot of other groups as well. It was just honestly a garbage bin of pleurodontan lizards. And while many of these groups that were previously classified as iguanids are now classified as being, well, their closest relatives, there are still nearly 50 species of iguanas that I would call true iguanas in the family Iguanidae, including this little guy, which is probably the most surprising member of the family. It's pretty much the only one without iguana in its common name. Most people are surprised when I tell them that this lizard, the infamous chuckwalla, the only lizard known to frighten Chuck Norris, and a lizard not to be chucked with, lest you find out, or so I have read, is an iguana. Though they're much less surprised when I mention how much its head looks like that of a marine iguana. And while the chuckwalla is more closely related to marine iguanas than marine iguanas are to, say, desert iguanas, Cyclura iguanas, like rhinoceros iguanas, or the 4 species of Fijian iguanas, their closest relatives are the 2 members of the genus Iguana. So the chuckwalla is firmly and unquestionably a true iguana, despite the fact that they lack the dorsal spines and dewlaps that are very common across the group. Hard to jam those things between rocks, though. They also lack the whip-like tail and super sharp claws present in many of the other members of the group. Now let me tell you, you think you know iguanas. Like, you probably know about green iguanas. But what about the other member of their genus, the lesser Antillean iguana? You probably know about marine iguanas and rock iguanas, perhaps desert iguanas. But have you ever seen one of these before? Or this? Iguanas are amazing. They really need their own video. But that last one, while it is called an iguana, is not actually part of the Iguanidae. So just to reiterate, chuckwallas are totally iguanas, no question. But this, whatever it is not an iguana. At least, it's not an iguanid. And I don't think that chameleons are iguanas. I've never heard anybody claim that. Though I am frequently asked if my bearded dragons are iguanas, and they're no more iguanas than are chameleons. But unless chameleons are iguanas, then being in the Iguania is not enough to call something an iguana. So I guess the question is, are all iguanas iguanids? Or is it possible that this thing is a true iguana too? Well, the 10 remaining families of pleurodontans are more closely related to one another than they are to the family Iguanidae. Which means that if iguana is a true iguana, which I assume that it is, and any member of these other 10 families, then all of the members of these other 10 families must be iguanas as well. And these 10 remaining families are nested in 2 major clades, one with 3 families and one with 7. And I'm super excited about both of them. But I'll start with the smaller clade because it contains lizards that can run on water, as well as this lizard that we found in Peru that I had never seen before in my life, the Amazon forest dragon, one of the 20 species in the family Hoplocercidae from Central and South America. These lizards are frequently called dwarf iguanas for reasons that seem perfectly reasonable, at least assuming that they are actually iguanas. They are relatively small but robust little lizards with strong vertebral crests. They are also often called wood lizards and even dragons, though dragon is usually reserved for the family Agamidae that we'll be discussing shortly. That said, they really remind me of mountain horned dragons. One species even has horns. They're just found on the wrong side of the world, and, well, their teeth are all wrong. Some have spiked tails, with the most extreme example found on the spiny weapon tail I really, really like these lizards. And if I hadn't gone to the Amazon or made this video, I could have easily gone my whole life without ever even knowing that they existed. Good thing I did both of those things. And thanks to Lepidosaur 2024, we can know every lizard family on the planet by the end of this year. So happy Lepidosaur 2024. The closest relatives of these dwarf iguanas are two of the coolest families of lizards anywhere. The family Crotophytidae, the collared lizards, and Corydophanidae, the basilisks. You tell me which one of these two is coolest. I'll start with the collared lizards because I recently learned something surprising about them. That isn't to say that it didn't make a ton of sense. I just never heard this before. So here in Utah, we have collared lizards. They are one of the coolest lizards in the state, and that's saying a lot. We have a ton of red lizards. Now this is an unusual family in this clade, as it is found exclusively in North America, mostly in the desert, and is carnivorous with vertebrates making up a non-trivial portion of their diet. Not what you normally think of when you think of an iguana. They also have no spines or dewlaps or anything like that. And there are about 9 species of collared lizards in the genus Crotophytus. But what I didn't realize was that there is a second genus in the family. A genus of lizards that are also on my list of raddest lizards in Utah, the genus Gambelia, the 3 species of leopard lizards. I mean, in retrospect, they act and look basically like collared lizards. They just don't have a collar. And that is why molecular phylogenetics is so valuable. It is so easy to get hung up on something conspicuous to your subjective senses and totally overlook all of the other evidence that would have more accurately informed your understanding. Oh, and just because it's rad, crotophytid lizards often run on 2 legs, like Tyrannosaurus rex. You gotta admit that's rad. And something that they very much have in common with their closest relatives, the 11 species of basilisks, helmeted, and casqueted iguanas in the family Corydophanidae, found from Mexico to Ecuador. Which are only iguanas if collared lizards and leopard lizards are as well. Which isn't an obvious sell to me, but maybe they're just the oddballs of the group. Now I don't know if you've ever seen a helmeted iguana before, but how cool is that? As a group, this family is all kind of wiry, fast-running lizards that generally can also run on 2 legs, and in some cases, right over the surface of water. There's even a great song about it if you ever get a chance to watch this video. They are generally great climbers that live in forests and often have elaborate crests on their heads, backs, and tails, especially in males. And they can't drop their tails. I like that about them. And that brings us to the larger clade of potential iguanas. And remember, for helmeted iguanas to be true iguanas, then not only do the dwarf iguanas and collared lizards need to be iguanas, but also everything in this other clade as well. Because all 10 of these families are more closely related to one another than they are to the iguanids. Now the family most closely related to the other 6 in this second clade is the family Tropiduridae. Odds are that you have never heard of this family. But this thing, the glorious green thorny tail iguana, it's one. As are some of the coolest lizards that we found in Peru, such as the olive tree lizard and the collared tree lizard, and one of the lizards that I was most hoping to find during our adventure, the western leaf lizard, which we did find. And if you've never seen a tropidurid before, it's probably because you've never been to South America, or you didn't spend nearly enough time wandering around looking for lizards, because they are fairly common there, but are only found in South America and its associated islands like Trinidad and the Galapagos. Because it is difficult for eggs to incubate at high altitudes, the fact that many of the members of this family are live bearers has allowed them to be some of the few lizards that you find high in the Andes Mountains. They are found in desert locations, jungles, on islands, in the trees, and on the ground. Iguanids may be the most famous lizards in the Galapagos, but there are way more endemic tropidurids. The remaining 6 families in the pleurodonta fall into 2 clades of 3 families each. And they are, altogether, the closest relatives of the Tropiduridae. And I don't know which clade we should discuss first. They both contain some rad iguanas, but this clade contains this lizard. This is a monkey anole, also called a forest iguana. But is that true? We've done a video on them in the past. We did find one in the Amazon. And while we're collectively trying to decide if it's actually an iguana, I have heard on many occasions that it isn't an anole. Well, that's reason enough for me to start there. Even though that will mean that we will have to wait a moment longer before we can find out how those dang Malagasy iguanas ever got to Madagascar. But don't worry, you'll be glad we started here, because the family least closely related to the other two in this clade is the family Phrynosomatidae. And this family is definitely going to need its own video in the future. It is also a family that I think really throws a wrench into the "these are all iguanas" narrative, because it contains things like this. Horned lizards, some of the most charismatic and grumpy looking lizards on the planet. And these, side-blotched lizards, which have 3 different types of males, just for the record. And a lot of other common lizards here in Utah, like these. And zebra-tailed lizards, which are the fastest lizards I have ever caught. They're just a blur. As well as earless lizards and California rock lizards that look a lot like collared lizards, but with partially covered ears, fringe-toed lizards, and many more. It's a rad group of mostly desert lizards found primarily in North America, but as far south as Panama. About 170 total species. They're some of the most common lizards that I see, so I'm really looking forward to digging into them. And just for the record, I will never run out of incredible animals to show you guys. I will just eventually run out of life. And if you want to help me to increase the amount of my life that I can devote to creating videos like this one, please consider supporting us on Patreon. That is legitimately the reason that you have seen such an increase in the depth and quality of our videos over the last few years. So thank you to all of you that have been supporting us, and for all of you that will in the future. You're making this happen. So our horned lizards, iguanas. While you're thinking about that, I will introduce you to the 2 families most closely related to the horned lizards and the other members of the family Phrynosomatidae. The family Polycrotidae, which is the family that includes this guy, and the family Dactyloidae, which are their closest relatives. Now, of course, for any of the other non-iguanids that we've been discussing to be iguanas, both of these families would need to be as well. So, what are they? Well, let's start with the monkey anole, which apparently is not an anole, but it is one of the 8 species in the family Polycrotidae, which are frequently called bush anoles. They're found in Central and South America, as well as many nearby islands. I can tell you that these are some seriously wonderful little lizards. And beautiful. They are very similar to anoles in many ways. They have a fairly similar body build, though their tails are probably a bit longer proportionally, and their face is a bit shorter, though still pointy. They have very similar eyes, which are a bit like those of chameleons, and they have very prominent flag-like dewlaps. It's not hard to see why they're often called anoles. That and the fact that their closest relatives are the anoles. The more than 425 species of unquestioned anoles in the family Dactyloidae are apparently the closest living relatives of the bush anoles, and vice versa. Not long ago, we discussed the fact that high-contrast Chinese bamboo bears are not pandas. And the reason that they are not pandas is because pandas, actual pandas, are much more closely related to all sorts of other things than they are to giant pandas. But if the closest relatives of pandas were these black and white bears, and vice versa, do you know what I think would be a totally reasonable name for them? Giant pandas. So are bush anoles actual anoles? I mean, they don't have to be. They're the hagfish of anoles. You can include them or not. But I'm certainly not going to correct anyone who calls a monkey anole from now on. Or a monkey anole, even though that's technically not the correct pronunciation. And that's even despite the fact that there's still some question about their relationship. But that's still not a panda. Slim Shady out. So let's talk about the unquestioned anoles. We found some beautiful anoles in Peru. I've found anoles in Alabama, Florida, and the Bahamas. You can probably name a few species, but as has been the case with many things here, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And there are well over 400 species in 8 genera, and they're found all over the warmer parts of the Americas. We definitely need to dive into this family in the future. I mean, just look at these. They can generally be identified by their long pointed faces, flag-like dewlaps, and gecko-like toes that allow them to cling to smooth surfaces. They're really special lizards. But the question is, of course, are the iguanas. And that gets us to the final 3 families in the pleurodonta, and how some of the members of this clade managed to get to Madagascar. And the family most distantly related to the other 2 is the family Leolamidae, which is a family of beautiful lizards that you've probably never seen, at least before today, unless you live in South America. There are well over 300 species after all. They feed almost exclusively on fruits and vegetation. There were a lot of lizards unlike any I had previously seen that I caught when I lived in Mollendo, Peru and on the island of Amantani. I didn't have any means of identifying them at the time, but I'm pretty sure that this is what they were. They're really common on the western coast of South America, and that's right where I was. And I will say, they were beautiful. I love them. But they aren't iguanas. I'm going to go ahead and say that all of the iguanas are in the Iguanidae. And all of their closest relatives are just iguana adjacent. And that includes the 2 closest relatives of the Leolamidae, the 34 species in the family Leosauridae of Central and South America, often called tree lizards, Patagonian lizards, fathead anoles, even though they aren't anoles, smooth steppe and big head iguanas, even though I'd say they aren't iguanas, but what they are really stocky, often big-headed, robust little lizards. And then the 8 species of Madagascan iguanas in the family Pleurodontidae, which are the ones we've been waiting to discuss. So all of these pleurodontan lizards have been from the Americas, except for the Fijian iguanas, which certifiably are iguanas, and these, which are not actually very closely related to the Fijian iguanas. And they live ridiculously far from both Fiji and the Americas. So how'd they get there? And when? Because the more recently this happened, the more insane this voyage becomes. Well, it appears that these Malagasy pleurodontans diversified from their closest American cousins about 60 million years ago. To my knowledge, we have no fossils of pleurodontans in Africa, though it is possible that they rafted to Africa and from Africa to Madagascar. That said, if it happened, there's no evidence of it. Similarly, they could have traveled to Antarctica, which at that time was not glaciated, and was full of South American taxa, as the 2 were in very close proximity. So they may have made their way up to Madagascar in a similar way to the way that marsupials got to Australia, though Australia was much closer to Antarctica than was Madagascar. We don't have many fossils from Antarctica for some reason, but this explanation, it doesn't even seem as likely as the Africa hypothesis. Honestly, the most likely explanation in my estimation is simply that they rafted directly from South America to Madagascar. It was at this time possible to travel in a straight line from South America to Madagascar, and given what ocean currents are like today, that seems very likely to have been what happened. Obviously, this is a pretty freak event, but we only have evidence that something like this has happened twice in the last 90 plus million years in the pleurodonta. And I've got to tell you, you probably shouldn't buy lotto tickets. The chances that you will win are so small that it's just never going to happen. Well, not never. I mean, if you play every week for 90 million years, well, the odds that you will win a time or 2 are much more in your favor. So we have some pleurodontans in Madagascar, but they're not the only iguanians in Madagascar. Though I've never heard anybody call this an iguana. In fact, despite the fact that there are anoles called false chameleons, you're unlikely to confuse this with anything else. Chameleons are quite possibly the weirdest of all lizards. I mean, even snakes aren't that weird if you consider how many times leg loss and reduction has happened in Lepidosauria. But chameleons are delightfully bizarre. And almost half of the 200 or so species live in Madagascar, with the rest of them in and around Africa. However, to talk about them, we need to wander out of the pleurodonta to the other clade of iguanian lizards, the Acrodonta. You know, the clade with the ossicone teeth. And while Acrodonta only contains 2 families, they are 2 absolutely amazing families, without a single species living in the Americas that wasn't introduced by humans. Both families are definitely weird and amazing enough to warrant their own videos. And the truth is that I don't know which family is cooler. I'm really going to need your help deciding. So let's start with the chameleons of the family Chameleonidae. They're insane. Where do we start? eyes, feet, tails, long tongues, or how tiny they can be. Let's just go in order. They have crazy eyes, like these. Actually, more like these. We've seen similar eyes in groups like the two Anoles families. Their eyelids, top and bottom, are fused shut, with just a tiny opening through which the pupil can see. Their eyes can move independently of one another, allowing them to look in two very different directions all at the same time, and their brains can process that. And for their size, they have some of the best vision of any vertebrate. Visual acuity is based more on total eye size and not relative eye size, but they have the densest accumulation of cone cells in their eyes of any vertebrate on the planet. They are very visual, which is good because, like their cousins, the earless lizards, they have no external ears. They can hear, but like snakes, it isn't their strongest sense. And unlike snakes, smell isn't their strongest sense either. Their tongues are, well, otherwise occupied. But first, let's talk about their weird feet. They're seriously weird. That was one of the major flaws with our chameleon skeleton. Its feet were not nearly weird enough. Chameleons have 5 toes on each foot. That's not that weird. But they functionally have just 2. Oppositely oriented toes. Their bodies are laterally compressed, like a sunfish, where most lizards are dorsoventrally compressed, like a stingray. And on each foot, they have 1 toe bundle that faces towards the body and 1 that faces away from the body. On their front feet, the body side toe bundle has 3 toes. On their back feet, the away side toe bundle has 3 toes. And this is a spectacular arrangement for holding onto branches. But that isn't their only tool for holding on. Most species have long prehensile tails that curl the opposite direction to that of the curly-tailed lizards. And they can hold onto a branch, extend their bodies, and reach for other faraway branches. They aren't jumpers. In fact, they do nothing fast, and they don't tend to take leaps. The only thing they do quickly is grab their prey. Something they can do from great distances thanks to their incredible projectile tongues that we discussed in this video. Snout to vent length, or the length of the body without the tail, is a common measure of size in many animals. And the tongue of most larger chameleons is 150 to 200% of the snout to vent length. In smaller chameleons, it's even longer. I can't wait to go into more detail about this when we do a full video about chameleons. Now, I said that smaller chameleons have proportionally longer tongues than larger chameleons. And the truth is that chameleons can be exceptionally small. Like one of the smallest of all known vertebrates kind of small. I mean, look at that. They also change color, more to indicate mood than to blend in. And changing color to communicate is something that they very much share with many of their closest relatives in the family Agamidae, which may not be as weird, but what it lacks in weirdness, it makes up for in pure diversity. In many ways, the Agamids alone fill in Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, and countless islands in between all of the roles that the 12 families of pleurodontan lizards work together to fill in the Americas. There are 550 Agamid species, so it isn't that shocking, I guess. But let's just look at a slideshow of Agamid lizards, often simply called dragons, for just a moment. I mean, you have fairly normal looking agamids that fill typical lizard roles. Basically the collared lizards of dragons, like the butterfly agamas and a ton of others. You have some Anole-like agamids. The chuckwalla-like uromastics. The thorny devil is basically a horned lizard, except even more hardcore. Sailfin dragons kind of fill that large iguana role. And water dragons, that of the basilisk. I guess also maybe with the sailfin dragons. Plus there's some that fly, or at least fall with style. And toad-headed agamas are the lizard response to the sarcastic fringe head. Frilled dragons are cooler than dinosaurs, some would say. Forest and horned dragons look familiar. And that is just scratching the surface. We could spend a month in the Agamidae. And maybe someday we will. Agamid August. It's got a nice ring to it. But which of all these groups that we've discussed today should we dig into first? As always, like and subscribe. We'll see you real soon. Oh, that's the word yes.
Yes.
And yes.
Juice.
And juice. It also includes iguanas. Leiocephalidae. Leo? How do you say L-E-I-O? I before E except after C, or when it has another vowel and it's part of a 3-vowel chain preceding a C. Not directly before the C, but on the other side of an O that is then followed by a C. Then you go L-E-I instead of L-I-E.
Yes, sure.
No further questions. Or when sounding like A is in neighbor and way. And on weekends and holidays and all throughout May, and you're wrong no matter what you say.
I wanted to make the...
Didn't know we were going to have a drag race.
Yeah.